It is so good to see you guys, so good to see the balcony crew. If you ever travel to New York City, there are several iconic hotels that you might want to check out. For example, there's the Plaza Hotel, kind of this world-famous hotel that overlooks Central Park. Then there's what's called the Algonquin Hotel, which has long been known as a literary hangout. And for a cool $650, you too can spend the night in the same hotel where such giants as William Faulkner and Maya Angelou once spent the night. Then there's the Hotel Edison, whose claim to fame is that it was Thomas Edison himself who flipped the switch on the marquee lights in 1930. But there was another famous hotel from New York that you may have seen in the news over the past week. It's called the New Yorker Hotel. I've got a picture of it. You can see it's sort of the exterior. It's got a long and sort of strange history, just like the Hotel Edison. It also opened in 1930. But today it's owned by the Unification Church, which is a cult based in South Korea. So if you've ever heard of the Moonies, they're the folks who actually own the building, but it's operated by the Wyndham Hotel Company. And the reason it was in the news is because of the actions of a 48-year-old man named Mickey Barreto. Now, all week long, I wanted to say Mickey Burrito every time I told this story. So if that slips out, just be patient with me. But his name is Mickey Barreto. In 2018, he moved from Los Angeles to New York City. And upon his arrival, he did what anybody would have done. He immediately booked a one-night stay in the New Yorker Hotel. The next day, though, he was reading through this law that had recently been passed called the Rent Stabilization Act, and he filed some paperwork requesting that the operators and owners of the hotel enter into a 6-month lease agreement with him as a tenant of that particular room. They, of course, refused to do so, kicked him out of his room. The next day, he filed a lawsuit against the hotel, took it to court, and amazingly enough, the judge sided with him and said that the hotel was guilty of wrongful eviction, and it forced them to allow him to move back into this room that he had rented for that one night. Now, get this. According to the Associated Press, from July of 2018 into September of 2023, they sort of had this standoff. Mickey Barreto kept asking the owners of the hotel to enter into this lease agreement. They kept refusing, but they couldn't figure out a way to evict him legally. And so for 5 years, he lived out of this hotel room completely rent-free. Didn't pay one dime in 5 years. If that's not crazy enough, though, what got him in trouble finally is at the end of 2023, around September, he filed a falsified deed with the city clerk in New York City, claiming that the Unification Church had actually signed over the entire property to him, and he then started trying to collect rent from everybody else that was checking into the hotel, which finally got him kicked out. The headline in the New York Times said, "Suspect charged with trying to steal the New Yorker hotel." The district attorney in New York, in a press conference last Friday announcing all of the different charges, said this. He said, "Mickey Barreto repeatedly and fraudulently claimed ownership of one of the city's most iconic landmarks, the New Yorker Hotel. We will not tolerate manipulation of our city's property records by those who seek to scam the system for personal gain." Now, here's the deal. Can you imagine having the audacity to claim ownership of something as iconic as a hotel when you knew deep down inside it wasn't yours? If you have your Bible or your phone with you, I want you to turn to Matthew 21, and we're going to look at the story of another property standoff that promoted a deadly dispute. Now, if you were here last weekend, we're in this series called The Week the World Turned, and we're exploring the final week of Jesus' life on earth. We started last weekend by looking at his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the first Sunday of the Passover feast. It was meant to be this unmistakable sign to anybody that was paying attention that this long-awaited Messiah was finally arriving and he was going to set things right. If you remember last week we talked about the Passover, one of the 3 great festivals that every Jewish person who was able was expected to celebrate inside the city of Jerusalem. So people would come from all over the place to do two things. First, they wanted to remember God's deliverance of their ancestors from Egyptian slavery. And secondly, they wanted to offer a sacrifice. And so since you had people coming from every direction, the population of Jerusalem, which hovered somewhere around 40,000 normally, would swell to around 200, maybe 250,000. So everywhere you look, it's wall-to-wall people, which always creates a certain energy. But adding to the excitement this year is that people are starting to talk about Jesus and some of the things he's done. And then you had the parade on the day before in which the people line the streets and wave the palm branches. And now the question that everybody's asking is, what is he going to do next? Like, how do you follow up something like a parade in which everybody hails you as a hero and welcomes you into the city? So by the time that first Sunday came to an end, it says that Jesus withdrew from Jerusalem and he went to Bethany, this little village. It was located a couple miles outside Jerusalem where he liked to hang out. And while he's gone, everybody's looking at each other, asking the question, what's going to happen now? Like, everybody's got questions. A few people have opinions. But the one thing that everybody wants to know is, what is he going to do next? And the answer to that question is the next morning, on Monday morning, Jesus and his entourage, his disciples, they re-enter the city. And when they do, the first place Jesus goes is the temple. And he does something that apparently he had done at least once before. Now, the reason I say that is because one of the things that trips people up when they read this story is that it's mentioned in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all give us some version of this story. But when you begin to retrace the steps, the timeline doesn't seem to match. For example, Matthew, Mark, and Luke put this on the Monday of the final week of Jesus' life. But if you go back to John's gospel, John puts it near the beginning of Jesus' ministry, some 3 years earlier. That's one of the famous discrepancies that critics of the Bible will often point to try and discredit the Bible. But I think the simplest solution is that this is probably something Jesus did on two separate occasions. He did it once during the beginning of his ministry. He did it again during the final week of his life on earth. And in that sense, these two events, these two cleansings of the temple, serve as kind of bookends to his life. Now, with that being said, what does all this mean, and what is Jesus up to? You're tracking with us. Here's the first thing I want you to know. Just like Jesus' entrance into the temple was the public announcement of his kingship, his cleansing of the temple is an unmistakable claim of his authority over the temple. It's hard for us, sitting here in 2024, to imagine just how big of a deal the temple was in the first century. It was not just like the center of their community. It was the epicenter of the entire Jewish culture. I've got an artist's rendering of what the temple most likely looked like. We're going to put that on the screen. You can see this massive complex. Now, this is actually what's called the second temple, because the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 536 BC. But you look at this, the Roman historian Josephus tells us that the temple complex, it wasn't just a building, the entire complex covered around 40 acres. And it took 46 years to complete the construction. And part of it was actually still under construction when Jesus went there that day. And all of this was happening under the watchful eye of a king called King Herod the Great. But to understand the significance of that building, you have to understand some of the different functions that happened there. So since it was thought to be the place where God's presence dwelt, it was primarily meant to be a place of worship. But over the centuries, over time, there were some other things that started to happen there that were also really important. Not only was it a place of worship, it was kind of the capital building of the entire Jewish nation. It was where all the decisions were made. It was where the Sanhedrin, which was like a combination of the Congress and the Jewish Supreme Court, met. It's where they had all of their meetings. It's where political rallies were held. Because the temple loaned money, There was a national bank that operated out of the temple. So if you wanted to borrow money, you had to go to the temple because it was the biggest place around. Any kind of major event happened inside that temple complex. So by the time Jesus rolled into Jerusalem on the Monday of the last week of his life, the temple had become like this huge tourist destination. It was like the National Cathedral, the Vatican, the Federal Reserve, Disneyland, the U.S. Capitol, Rupp Arena. I mean, it's all one big thing, one incredibly impressive complex. And that's part of what makes what Jesus did so startling. So I want you to try and imagine this scene. The day before, he's rode in the back of a donkey. People everywhere, man, they're lining the streets, thousands of people. The crowd is still pretty amped up from what happened the day before. They get up on Monday morning. Everybody's kind of watching for Jesus. They're wanting to know, what is he going to do next? And one of the things that you can kind of infer as you read the text is after that parade on Sunday, it's very likely that Jesus spent some time sort of scouting the area. He looked over things. He went close to the temple, and he looked in, and what he saw bothered him. And I don't know if he slept any that night or not, but the next morning, the first place he goes is the temple. And he commences to clean house. Check this out, Matthew 21, verse 12. Jesus entered the temple courts, and he drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the temple, the tables of the money changers, and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked him. Yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read from the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise? And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night. One of the things I've always loved about this story is that when Jesus arrives on the scene, he doesn't hesitate to take action, which is kind of weird when you think about it. So, because of my job, I'm in and out of a lot of different places and even in and out of different people's homes. But there's never been a moment, at least that I can remember, that I walked into somebody else's house and started rearranging the furniture. I've thought about it. You know what I mean? You look at that and say, I think it would look better over here. But I've never actually done it, and I bet you haven't either. Or think about it like this. If you came into church this morning, some random person showed up, and they started not just rearranging the furniture, but turning the furniture over and carrying furniture out, you would immediately be looking for the safety team to come in, tackle them and drag them out instead of them dragging the furniture out. I mean, you don't expect people to rearrange the furniture in houses that they don't own. And yet when you look at this story, that seems to be exactly what Jesus is doing. Here's this incredibly huge, this incredibly important place, and Jesus comes in and he just sort of takes over. What's he doing? He's claiming his authority over his Father's house. Now, three things that happen in this story that I think happen whenever Jesus shows up anywhere. And if you want to track with us, here's the first thing Jesus does. He removes barriers. One of the things that's true about the temple is that it was designed around the concept of limited access. What I mean by that is you explore the inner workings of the temple, there were certain places that only certain people were allowed to go. So I've got this diagram that hopefully will help explain this. On the outer edge, I know you can't read this, but on the outer edge is what's called the courtyard of the Gentiles. That's where anybody that wanted to go was able to go there. They were welcome to go there. But then once you got past that and you got deeper into the temple, the access got more and more restricted. So you go from the court of the Gentiles to the court of women, which is where both men and women were allowed to go as long as they were Jewish. Then you got to the court of the Israelites, which is where only Jewish men were allowed to go. Then you get past that, you get to the court of priests, which you had to be a priest to go. Then you got to the what they called the holy place, which only priests who were on duty could go. And then finally you wound up in what was called the Holy of Holies. And the only person allowed in there was the high priest that year. And even then, he can only go in one day of year on the Day of Atonement. So you got this sort of limited access, and certain people can only go certain places. And the incident where Jesus shows up, where all this happens, is the court of the Gentiles. It's a place where everybody was welcome to go. So you have all these travelers, both Jews and Gentiles, who are in the city trying to conduct business, and this is where all the business happens. At the same time, remember, this is during the Passover festival, and so you got people coming from everywhere, and they're coming, remember, to celebrate God's deliverance of their ancestors and to offer a sacrifice. But here's what would happen. Remember, you got people coming from every direction, from outside the city, and they don't want to travel with their animals. Like if you're traveling with your animal that you're going to sacrifice, the animal might get injured, it might run off, somebody might steal it. And so what had happened, you had some entrepreneurs who were connected to the temple. They had set up these little booths inside the courtyard of the Gentiles where you could buy an animal that was pre-approved to be sacrificed. Now, think through this with me. There's one place on earth where you're sanctioned to offer a sacrifice to God. And you have a group of people who work at the temple who have to approve your animal to be sacrificed, who just happen to sell animals that have already been pre-approved to be sacrificed. I mean, you talk about a monopoly, man, they've got it. And so what would happen is, as the price would continue to climb throughout the week, as animals got scarcer and you had to buy it from them, more and more people were economically eliminated from being able to worship God. And so when Jesus shows up, he sees what's happening. The other thing that was happening that must have really irked Jesus is it says there were these money changers. What that means is no matter where you were coming from, everybody that visited Jerusalem had to pay what was called the temple tax. But in order to do that, you first had to exchange your Roman currency for the temple's own currency. And of course, when you did that, there was an interest rate you had to pay. And so Jesus sees that, and he realizes that the people who are supposed to be leading the other people in worship are instead making money off of them and eliminating some of them. And so Jesus sees that, and he decides that he's going to do something about it. The very next thing he does is he sees the lame people, the disabled people. And again, he says that he heals them. And we read that and we think that's no big deal because we've read the other stories about Jesus. And we know that's what Jesus likes to do, right? That's just who he is. So he sees not dead people, but deaf people and blind people and disabled people, and he heals them. But we kind of miss the point of the story because it's hard for us to imagine. But in the first century Jewish culture, there were places they couldn't go. And there were worship events that they couldn't participate in because of their disability. And so Jesus, knowing what's up, he begins to heal those people. And through healing them, he restores their access to God. He removes the barriers that are keeping them from God. So make sure you understand what's happening. This is not a story about Jesus going to the temple and losing his temper or allowing his frustration to boil over. It's much deeper than that. He goes to the temple, and he immediately starts to intentionally remove the barriers that are keeping people from experiencing a relationship with God. This is not about Jesus getting angry. This is about Jesus doing something to enable access to his Father. One writer said, when Jesus turned over those tables, he opened the gates. These gates have been closed. These walls have been erected. And Jesus goes in and he immediately begins to tear them down. Now here's my question. Do you think it's possible that in the intervening 2,000 years that maybe the church, as good as our intentions have been, haven't inadvertently re-erected some of those same barriers that Jesus came to tear down? Think about it. Economic barriers, barriers built around what people wear, where they live, what they drive, what their job title might be. Racial barriers, political barriers. Some of you grew up in environments in which there were all kinds of barriers built around traditions about things that really don't matter. Things like Bible translations and denominational labels and styles of worship. I mean, I'm convinced that one of the things that happens whenever Jesus shows up in the life of a church is that he immediately begins to tear down the barriers that have separated people from God so that more and more people can have an experience with him. Now here's the second thing he does, and this kind of builds on the first. He removes the barriers, and then he redirects worship. If you go back and you read, I hope you'll do this, go back and read later how all the different gospel writers tell this story. They all tell some version of this story, and they all highlight something that's easy to miss if you get caught up in the emotion. Right? You're reading this, you think, oh boy, Jesus is angry, and he's turning over tables, and you get kind of caught up in that, and you miss something that's really important. It says when he drove out the money changers, he also drove out the people who were selling the animals, which means he drove out the animals themselves. And here's why that's important. For a Jewish person, how do they experience the forgiveness of their sins? They have to offer a sacrifice to God. The Old Testament says that the blood of the sacrifice enables God to forgive you. Leviticus 17:11 says it like this: "For the life of the creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." Now, atonement is just a big theological word, but one way to think about it is that it just means at one-ment. So here's the way to think about it. Because of our sin, there's this distance that's developed between us and God. We've been separated from God, but through the blood of the sacrifice, our sins can be atoned for, which means we can now close that distance and we can be at one, at least temporarily, with God. We can experience at one-ment with God. So you got 250,000 people have come to Jerusalem. They're there to celebrate what God has done in the past for their ancestors. They're also there to offer a sacrifice so that they can experience at one-ment with God. And now Jesus has come in, and he's at least temporarily upended the entire system. I mean, how do you offer a sacrifice if all the animals have been driven out of the temple? And how do you experience forgiveness if there's no blood of a sacrifice to lay on the altar? And the answer is you can't unless there's something, or in this case, someone who's prepared to offer a better sacrifice. Now, because you know the rest of the story, you can hopefully see how all of this is leading up to what will happen a few days later on the Friday, on the last week of Jesus' life. Hebrews 10, the Bible says it like this: "And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices," which is what they did in the temple, "which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet." Now make sure you catch this. Jesus did not come to interrupt worship. He came to redirect it. And he didn't come to make a scene. He came to make an announcement. He was making an announcement of an inauguration of an entirely new way of relating to God that was based not on the sacrifice of animals, but on the sacrifice of his Son. We'll go back to a quote I shared last weekend from N.T. Wright. Here's what he said: "The resurrection completes the inauguration of God's kingdom. It is the decisive event demonstrating that God's kingdom really has been launched on earth as it is in heaven. The message of Easter is that God's new world has been unveiled in Jesus Christ, and that you're now invited to belong to it." And that brings me to the last thing Jesus does whenever he shows up. He removes barriers, he redirects worship, and he rewrites the story. I love in Matthew's telling of this story that he says the first people to really understand what was happening were a group of children. Check this out in verse 15. Go back to it. "But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Do you hear what they're saying? They asked him. Yes, Jesus replied, have you never read from the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, called forth your praise? Try to imagine. Here's these kids, man. They're either waiting on their parents or maybe they got nowhere else to go. And so they go to the temple and they're watching all these people flow in and out. And here comes Jesus, the guy that created such a scene the day before. And he storms into the temple and he begins turning over the tables and driving out the money changers. And they can't believe what they've seen. But yet somehow in that chaotic situation, it's a group of kids who start to put the pieces together and who start to realize what's really happening, while the experts, like all the religious guys, are over here and they're kind of watching, but they don't get it. From that moment forward, the religious leaders from the Jewish religion and the Roman political leaders realized they've got to do something. In Luke's telling of this same story, he adds a postscript in Luke 19. Here's what he says. He says, every day, talking about Jesus, he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find a way to do it because the people hung on his word. So what happens is, from this day forward, from Monday until Friday, Jesus will go back to the temple every day. And he'll spend all day telling stories, answering questions, and announcing the arrival of a new kingdom. And while all of that is going on in public and private, these Jewish political leaders and these Roman leaders are getting together and they're trying to figure out a way to eliminate arrival. I love the way Tim Keller said this. He wrote, either you'll have to kill Jesus or you'll have to crown him. But the one thing you can't do is just say, what an interesting guy. His claims don't allow that type of answer. So you go through that week, Jesus tells people exactly what's happening. Some of them get it, most of them refuse to believe it. And yet there are a few during that week that will continue on through the rest of that week right up until today that realize what Jesus came to do and intentionally place themselves under the authority of Jesus, and they accept Jesus as their king. And all of that starts during the final week of his life on earth. One of the things that's so interesting about this story is that Jesus' cleansing of the temple foreshadows something that would take place about 40 years later in AD 70. The Romans would come in and they would completely destroy the temple. There'd be nothing left. That's why if you go to Jerusalem today, the temple is no longer there. It was destroyed. And for the Jewish people, that's one of the most tragic events in a history that's been littered with lots of tragic events. But from a Christian perspective, the destruction of the temple was one more signpost on the road that announces, hey, we're moving from something old and we're moving into something new. Jesus came to do something, and now it's been inaugurated and it's in the process of being finalized. And here's why that matters. And this is what I really wanted to get to. So if you've been sort of zoned out, zone back in just for a second. When you get to the New Testament writers tell us that God's presence no longer dwells in temples and even in churches. You know where he lives? He lives in you. Paul said it like this in 1 Corinthians 3. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? Now don't miss this. Over and over again in the New Testament, the Bible says God no longer lives in buildings made by human hands, but he lives in your heart. And here's what you have to understand. When Jesus shows up in your heart, he will do the same three things he did at the temple that day. First, he's going to try to remove any barriers that are keeping you from experiencing the intimacy with God that you were created for. Secondly, he's going to redirect your worship, and sometimes it's painful, and he's going to do whatever it takes to pull your eyes off of the things that distract you and place your eyes on him. And then as he does that, he's going to continue to rewrite not just these stories, but he's going to rewrite your story in ways that you can't even imagine. But here's what you have to understand. For any of those things to happen, there's something that has to happen first. And that's that at some point in your spiritual journey, you have to sign over the ownership of your heart to him. I've got one last picture I want to show you. The reason Mickey Barreto, almost said burrito, but the reason Mickey Barreto has been charged with 14 felonies and 10 counts of criminal contempt is because he spent a significant number of years claiming ownership to something that wasn't his. And we read that and we think, man, that's a crazy story, but make sure you understand, we've all done some version of the same thing. If I don't miss my guess, most of us at some point in our past have placed ourselves under the authority of Jesus, and we've said, Jesus, you're the owner, and then throughout the rest of our lives, what are we doing? We're fighting for control for the deed to our heart. And we say, Jesus, I'm going to put your name on it, but I'm going to continue to try to keep writing my name on it too. And so you're not really in control, I'm going to be in control. And what Jesus says, if you're going to give him control, you got to give him ownership. You have to give him your heart. I want you to stand with me. The band's going to come, and we're going to sing a couple songs together. And if you're here this morning and you're ready to sign over the deed to your heart to the one who created it, we'd love to help you do that. If you're here and you're ready to get baptized into Christ, to join our church family, maybe you have questions about what your next steps should look like, David's right here. I'm going to be over here. We'd be glad to talk with you. We won't do anything to embarrass you. You don't have to say anything publicly. If you're uncomfortable talking to us now, we'll be up here after the service, and we'll be glad to talk with you. But whatever you need to do, we'd love to help you do that.